In addition to Sidney Powell, in addition to Sidney being a fierce legal mind, one of the other fierce legal minds that I've gotten to know and call a friend in my life is my next guest, Helen Davis Chaitman. She is a nationally recognized litigator with a diverse trial practice in the areas of lender liability, bankruptcy, bank fraud, RICO, professional malpractice, and trusts and estates. Among Helen's achievements, there are many. She was named one of the nation's top 10 litigators by the National Law Journal. She has authored the monthly newsletter, the Lender Liability Law Report, which is subscribed to by law firms and financial institutions through the United States. She and Mr. Gotthofer began publishing their book, J.P. Madoff, The Unholy Alliance Between America's Biggest Bank and America's Biggest Crook. You can go to their website, jpmadoff.com. And since early 2009, Helen has been an outspoken advocate for investors in the Bernie L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. She has lobbied in Congress on a pro bono basis for statutory changes to assure Madoff customers of the protections of the Securities Investor Protection Act, and she has testified twice before congressional committees on issues affecting securities investors. I encourage you to go to her website, jpmadoff, M-A-D-O-F-F, jpmadoff.com. Helen, welcome back to Operation Freedom.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that beautiful introduction.
I thank you for your courage, Helen, and I thank you for your tenacity in taking on the deep state and the swamp. You know, Helen, many people believe that the swamp starts and stops in Washington, D.C. But in fact, Helen, you have had the courage, when many people did not, to show that there is an equally deep and treacherous swamp in Wall Street. Educate our listeners on the swamp that you not only identified, but the swamp that you have taken on for your career.
Well, I think it's hard for people to understand, but banks like J.P. Morgan Chase have become criminal enterprises, and they're run very much like organized crime families. If you take J.P. Morgan Chase, in the period of time that Jamie Dimon has been the president and chief executive officer, J.P. Morgan Chase has pled guilty to 5 felonies. Now, felonies are things like robbery, murder, but when you have a bank and you commit felonies, they're on a massive, massive scale. So, for example, J.P. Morgan Chase has pled guilty in the last 6 years to manipulating foreign exchange rates. And the foreign exchange market is a $7 trillion a day market. So if J.P. Morgan Chase cheats every customer by a few dollars on every foreign exchange transaction, they can generate hundreds of millions of dollars in income by cheating their customers. They've pled guilty to crimes for defrauding homeowners with respect to residential mortgages. They've pled guilty in the last 6 years to crimes concerning the manipulation of the metals markets, where they tried to defraud people on the other side of metals transactions so that they could enrich themselves at their customers' expense. And now, as if we don't have enough felonies in the last 6 years, they're now being investigated for a lack of internal controls. And the term a lack of internal controls, what that really means is that people are committing crimes and the board of directors and J.P. Morgan Chase are looking the other way. In fact, what's happened with the banking system is that the major banks have criminalized their activities so that their profits are generated not by traditional banking activities, but rather by manipulating the silver market, manipulating the foreign exchange market, cheating every homeowner who takes out a mortgage. They've systematized financial crimes to such an extent that they can be one of the most profitable corporations in the country. And it's not simply J.P. Morgan Chase. Last week, Citigroup received a sanction of a $400 million fine from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which regulates banks. And in the consent order that Citigroup signed, it acknowledged that it had not complied with multiple laws and regulations. Now, if you or I didn't comply with a law, the federal government would come down on us so hard that we wouldn't know what hit us. But if you're a Citibank and you don't comply with federal laws and regulations, such as not defrauding your customers, you may be able to make hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. And the government, which is responsible to watch your activities, just gives you a slap on the wrist and you move on to the next crime. So until we recognize the criminality in the banking system, we're really not going to be able to protect the average American who inevitably has to deal with banks in terms of getting a home mortgage, in terms of getting a car loan, in terms of having an account where you can deposit funds, et cetera.
So, Helen, many people say, well, this criminality is so ingrained in the swamp in Wall Street, there's nothing that can ever be done, that this monster has gotten so out of control. There's nothing we can do. What do you say to those people?
Well, I think two things should be done. I think that the major banks should be broken up. We've had, over the last 30 years, the number of banks in the country has been drastically reduced because J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank have taken over smaller banks. They've just gobbled up these smaller banks so that they have a much larger share of the total market. I think that has to be reversed because when you have a huge bank like J.P. Morgan Chase or Citibank, the temptation to indulge in organized crime is irresistible, but particularly when it's combined with the bribes that are paid to people in Washington to assure that nobody really prosecutes them. And while I've just explained that the banks plead guilty to various felonies, nobody gets fired, nobody is prosecuted. It's just a slap on the wrist. They take the shareholders' money and pay a fine, but that doesn't prevent them from instituting a new criminal scheme the next day. So one thing would be to break up the large banks. The other thing that I would do if I were Attorney General is I would indict people like Jamie Dimon under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute. It was enacted by Congress in order to fight organized crime because we now have organized crime on a scale that the mafia never dreamt of, and that's within the banking system. And the irony of it is that if you prosecuted Jamie Dimon, it would have a ripple effect on Wall Street because the one thing the top executives of the banks haven't bargained for is to spend time in jail, and they haven't figured out a way to pay someone else to serve their criminal sentences. So if you prosecuted someone like Jamie Dimon and he went off to jail, it would clean up Wall Street almost overnight.
Folks, we're speaking with Helen Chaitman at JP Madoff, Madoff, jpmadoff.com. Helen, when I look at the Justice Department, whether it's under the direction of Eric Holder when Obama was president, or Loretta Lynch when Obama was president, or Jeff Sessions when President Trump is president, or William Barr, please tell me I'm wrong, but I get the same feeling that every once in a while there'll be a decision, some charges will be brought forward, and somebody will get some slap on the wrist fine, but no one will go to jail. I really don't see our Justice Department instituting the rule of law. I see it as almost like a club that the Justice Department, rather than going after these people for their crimes, they seem to give them passes. Is that, am I off? Tell me I'm off. Tell me I'm jaded on this.
You're 100% right. I was terribly disappointed when Eric Holder came up with this concept that you couldn't prosecute banks because they were too big and you might risk their failure. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you have a bank like J.P. Morgan Chase, which is run by a criminal, Jamie Dimon, he belongs in jail. Why would we expose the entire United States population to criminal bankers? And we have the same problem with the attorneys general we've had under the Trump administration. They treat Wall Street criminals with kid gloves. Why? Why is that? Why is nobody willing to stand up to a organized crime on a level which is unprecedented in the world to what we now see on Wall Street?
You know, Helena, here's another example. You sent me this article earlier this week. J.P. Morgan Chase is under a new federal investigation 1 month after getting slapped on its fourth and fifth criminal felony count. J.P. Morgan Chase Bank has been advised by one of its U.S. regulators of a potential civil money penalty action against the bank related to historical deficiencies in internal controls and internal audit over certain advisory and other activities. The bank already has controls in place to address the deficiencies related to the proposed penalty. The firm is currently engaged in resolution discussions with the U.S. regulator. There is no assurance that such discussions will result in resolution, end quote. Well, why is that? When you hear that as an attorney, why is that disturbing to you?
Well, because the government is treating them with kid gloves. The lack of internal controls means that people are committing crimes, and Jamie Dimon is not doing anything about it. Well, the reason he's not doing anything about it is he's allowing these crimes to be committed because the source of J.P. Morgan Chase's wealth is its criminal activities. We know from the mafia how profitable crime can be. And when you have a bank as large as J.P. Morgan Chase, they have so many ways of cheating the public. But that's why we have an attorney general. There's no one else other than the Department of Justice that has the size and the depth to prosecute crime on this level.
And you know, Helen, when you look at the media is complicit in this cover-up of what the banksters are doing.
You know what? There's no question about that. It doesn't matter. Well, certainly the Wall Street Journal, certainly the New York Times, but it's everyone. Nobody will publish the truth. And, you know, even if they carry a story about, like that Citibank has entered into this consent decree, it'll be 2 lines on the last page of the Wall Street Journal. It's kind of like, we don't really want people to know about this. But it's so shocking. I'm sure your listeners are shocked to hear that the major banks have committed crimes on such a massive scale. But we're the only ones who talk about it. 60 Minutes did an interview with Jamie Dimon, and it was a 60-minute interview, and they never mentioned the fact that under his control, J.P. Morgan Chase pled guilty to 5 felonies. I thought that was pretty newsworthy. If I were 60 Minutes, I'd like to talk about that for at least 6 minutes.
Well, and all they did was walk around with it. Actually, they brought him to Detroit, and they were talking about all the wonderful things he's done for Detroit and all this. And I contacted a number of companies and organizations that are doing wonderful work in Detroit. And they said, what about this Jamie Dimon? And they're 60 Minutes is parading him around like a show pony down there. And they go, what are you talking about? I mean, and Helen, you know, I one of my favorite stories that a guest has ever told on this show in 10 years since its inception is your story about when you brought this forward on Fox Business News with Maria Bartiromo. I know you're tired of telling it, but it serves a incredible purpose because we have new listeners every week, thousands from around the country. And actually this past week, over 100 folks from over 160 countries around the world listen to this show either live or listen to the podcast. Tell the story again of when you were interviewed by Maria Bartiromo and when you started talking about J.P. Morgan Chase and what happened.
Well, I received a phone call from one of her assistants asking if I would be on Maria's show. And I said, of course, I'd be delighted. And what would you like me to talk about? And he said, well, I'll get back to you. I'll talk to Maria. So it was getting closer and closer to the time of the show, and I wanted to be prepared for the subject. And I called up Maria's assistant, and I said, can you tell me what Maria will be talking with me about so I can prepare? And he said, I'll call you back, and he never called me back. So I show up at the studio in Rockefeller Center, and I was supposed to get there an hour and a half in advance, which seemed like unnecessary, but it turned out it was necessary because it took an hour to make me up, which was a little bit disappointing that it would take that long. But in any event, I said to the woman who was making me up, gosh, do you spend this much time with everybody? And because I hadn't spent that much time cumulatively in my entire life putting on makeup. And she said, well, but you're on for 7 minutes. And I said, well, I don't have a television. What is the significance of that? She said, well, 7 minutes is a really long time. You must be a really important person. So I said, oh, well, thank you so much. I never thought of that. So then I go on the show, and I was hoping I would have 2 minutes before the show started for me to say to Maria, what are we talking about? But that didn't happen. I was ushered in, and the lights went on, and Maria said, and now, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us the world's leading expert on Bernie Madoff. And Ms. Chaitman, tell us what you're doing these days to help the investors. I said, well, as a matter of fact, Maria, I'm suing J.P. Morgan Chase. Now, of course, J.P. Morgan Chase is one of the major sponsors of Maria's show. And she said, suing J.P. Morgan Chase, for heaven's sakes, why would you do a thing like that? I said, well, as a matter of fact, Maria, the evidence shows that J.P. Morgan Chase knew all along that Madoff wasn't buying securities for his investment advisory customers, and yet they kept his account for 20 years, and they had an obligation to close it. She said, well, why would they have to close a profitable account? I said, well, that's a good question, Maria, because in 1970, Congress enacted the Bank Secrecy Act, which imposed upon banks the obligation to report criminal activity or suspicious activity to the federal government. And at that point, I could hear some kind of static, or I didn't really know what the sound was, but I identified it as coming from Maria's earpiece. And she said, and now we have an emergency commercial. So the lights went on, and we were off camera, and I said, Maria, I don't have a television. What is an emergency commercial? And with that, 2 men in dark suits came on either side of me, lifted me out of my chair, and escorted me out of the studio. And the woman who'd spent an hour making me up, she said, what happened? You were supposed to be 7 minutes.
Take that.
So
and off you went. And did you ever hear from Maria again?
I did. I got an email from her assistant who said, Maria just loved the interview with you.
Loved you so much, he had the guys take
for someone else, but anyway.
And then what happened? Then they never came. She never came back to you for another interview, correct?
Oh, that's for sure. And then the next week, she had a half-hour interview with Jamie Dimon.
Oh, and of course, she asked him about what you brought up, correct?
Not exactly. That's a no-no. We don't talk about bad things.
It's absolutely incredible.
But what are we going to do about it? That's the real question. You know,
yeah, what are we going to do? We got to send somebody to prison, Helen.
I agree.
You know, Helen, in our last minute here, educate our listeners on jpmadoff.com and on the book. What when they get the book, what's the one thing that's going to surprise them the most?
So the best thing in the book is I have a chart which compares Carlo Gambino to Jamie Dimon. You know, their business practices, their ethics, and the only way they're different really is in their dress code. That's kind of fun.
Well, Helen, you are an incredibly courageous patriot. Our country and our world is so much better for your efforts. The deep state, the criminal banking syndicate, fears you, and that is probably the ultimate compliment anyone could ever have.